So, well, it's probably humanistic studies, isn't it?
No. Actually, we were expecting a couple of people. Now, there is another one for years. They've forgotten.
The Thursday clubs this week. We had one last night with Alex performing to 100 people in the Great Hall, which was a wonderful event, quite noisy. Today we had something more perhaps sober. I'm just welcoming you all. Alex is going to introduce our speaker tonight, as it was one of his suggestions for the club, as Alex is one of our PhD students on the board. So, welcome to everyone. Please note that Joe Banks is doing his disinformation on the Tuesday the 3rd of February, so we hope to see you in the And I've lost a pen. Right? Okay.
Yes, welcome tonight. Who's the Assistant Professor of Digital Media Programme in Writing and Humanistic Studies at MIT. It's very good to have you here. So we're going to be talking about interactive fiction and also hopefully a little bit about the subject of your new book, which is Racing the Beam, available.
What's it called, Alex?
Racing the Beam.
Raising the beam.
Racing. As in running.
Well, Nick will talk about it, but it's about the Atari 2600 platform, part of a new series.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Alex. Yeah, thanks very much for coming. I'm going to talk about mainly about this topic of interactive fiction that's very dear to my heart, and it's also a topic that isn't widely known as, for instance, video games, poetry, other things that people generally have an idea of, know what they're about. Sometimes are. So I'm going to introduce it a bit, and at the end of my talk, I will mention some about. Almost entirely different topic. These both have to do with creative uses of computing. But that second topic will be to give an idea of what platform studies and my and Ian Bogust's new book about the Atari video computer system particularly is, and why that's an interesting type of thing that we hope that others will join us in pursuing. So let me mention just about myself. I'm someone who has a creative practice in digital media, so I create poetry generation systems, interactive fiction pieces, one of which I'll show you later on. And I collaborate with others in doing various sorts of digital media, literary works, sometimes video pieces, and so on. I also write critically and theoretically about digital media. And if you like, you can visit my site, nickm.com. And in addition to advertising publications of mine that you can go off and buy or read from a library, it also has a lot of free digital work. Actually, the Electronic Literature Collection Volume 1, an anthology of 60 pieces that I edited with Kate Hales and Scott Redberg and Stephanie Strickland, is available entirely for free online. And then my own work, anything that is pretty much finished and is made of bits is also available there, cost-free. So the idea behind my work with interactive fiction is to start with this form. Some of you may be more or less familiar with interactive fiction. If this rings any bells, if you have a Z machine interpreter installed on your computer, could you let me know by raising your hand? A few people know about interactive fiction, but it's not exactly like YouTube in terms of popular cachet. This is 1976 piece that Will Crowther started and Don Woods added to, called Adventure, and it is widely considered, I think quite correctly, the first piece of interactive fiction, the first work of interactive fiction, simulation of the exploration of a cave in which you can participate by typing what you would like to do or what you would like your character to do. Now, my interest is in taking this form, which as early as 1976 was quite capable of doing the simulation of a world in an interesting literary way, and combining it with something somewhat different. The idea that one can vary the way that a story is told, even if you don't change things about the story itself. Right? And so this is one of the things that Raymond Queneau was up to in this 1947 book, Exercises in Style. This is Barbara Wright's translation. And the hope is that by taking this underlying idea of simulation that interactive fiction does well, and combining the idea of narrative variation, the idea of creating literary interest through telling things different ways, we achieve something new and exciting. So, the three things I'll address are, first of all, why interactive fiction is interesting to me and why I think it's of some broader interest. Why look at this particular form instead of something else, like story generation or more cinematically motivated video games or something entirely different. And then why this interest in the telling, specifically in the narration, in the way that the story is told rather than the things that are told. And finally, how a research system that I have, which I'm hoping to develop into something that can be publicly released and widely used, how the change in the narration is actually managed. So first of all, the question of why look at interactive fiction. Now, interactive fiction is actually successful in several ways. I'm going to sort of mention these first, and for those of you who aren't familiar with what IF is, we'll give an example, but this sort of could be done in either order, and maybe it's backwards, but here's how we'll do it. Interactive fiction offers a simulated microworld, a very limited domain in which things happen, and everything is modeled in the system. So it's not, for instance, just trying to crawl the web and make sense of everything that we read. It's bounded, and there are rules of the simulation that are interesting from a standpoint of a game designer, literary artist. It's also a dialogue system where there's natural language input and output. It takes a command like when you saw go east, somewhat guttural of a command, but nevertheless an English language command, and it responds to that in language. And this is something that's fairly special. When you play a multimedia CD-ROM game, you see a beautiful picture presented to you by the computer, and you don't draw a beautiful picture and hold it back up. You just take a mouse and click. But when you converse with an interactive fiction program, you provide text in response to text the computer gives you. Interactive fiction is a computer game. It's, as I've said in other cases, shouldn't be dismissed as a computer game, but it certainly is a computer game. And it's a fun form of entertainment, very successful commercially in the early 1980s. But it's also a form of aesthetic expression in literary art. Now, to give an idea of what the history of interactive fiction is like, in a very, very sketchy way, I mentioned, actually, I think this 1975 date is probably not correct, but in 1976, Will Crowther and Don Woods worked on Adventure. Zork, a famous piece of interactive fiction, was developed beginning 1977 at MIT. Later became a commercial work that was available here in the UK, among other places. And then after this early academic and research sort of exploration, sometimes called the mainframe age, not exactly accurately because a lot of times they were using mini computers. But after that mainframe age, there was this commercial era of interactive fiction where a very successful company, Infocom, was founded in the US. There was Level 9, Melbourne House, Magnetic Scrolls, other places in the English-speaking world, and even the person who later became Poet Laureate of the United States, Robert Pinsky, created an interactive fiction piece which in 1984 was published by Synapse. So this all occurred during this early 1980s time where it was lucrative to create, to develop and sell interactive fiction. And then interestingly, the one thing that happened in the academic landscape was in 1989, the Oz project that Joe Bates initiated took root there at Carnegie Mellon University, not for very long as it happened, and attempted to investigate interactive drama. But even after interactive fiction became not so saleable and the Oz project was dwindling, a lot of people independently began working with interactive fiction. Graham Nelson, who was at Cambridge, then now Oxford, released Inform, an interactive fiction development language, and Curses. And there are stunning pieces like Adam Cadre's I.O., which repudiated a lot of independent IF that had come before it. Emily Short's Galatea, a conversational chatterbot in an interactive fiction context. And then, for instance, in 2006, we had the release of two major development systems in Form 7 and TADS 3, along with the 12th annual interactive fiction competition, and the 14th one, as you might guess, was last year. And some of the things that occur that are provided by interactive fiction authors to us are not simply cave crawls, but things like Lovecraftian horror and a sinister dystopian science fiction, and sort of a curious slice of life with a literary edge piece, and a steampunk science fiction piece that conflates older technologies with computing, and systems of magic that are wrapped up with memory, and with the relationship of someone returning to a family home, and a thriller that's set in a science fictional universe. So there's a lot of things that have been created that go beyond bumbling around caves. Even though I think some of the early pieces about bumbling around caves were pretty interesting in their own way. So to give a concrete example of this, I want to take a look at a piece that I did in 2005 called Book and Volume. Let's see. This is the visual appearance of interactive fiction depends on the interpreter that you use, much as a browser has some effect on the web page that you're looking at. So I can as easily make this appear in a terminal window in a monospace font, but I'm going to show it like this today. And let me ask, could I ask one of the people who is conversant with interactive fiction, maybe, to come up and play this for us while I read what the computer is outputting. The thing about this is it's actually very, very effective in showing what the player does and what the computer does. I'll read the beginning, and then maybe someone will warm up to the idea. Your pager tickles you awake. Upstairs in the house of your childhood, in your room, and it must be time for school because, no, it's the weekend, you remember, but your alarm is going off anyway. You should have been awake already. You're going to miss the bus. Your mother climbs in the window. You're dreaming. You're a grown-up. It opens to you again, a sluggish window summoned by a mouse click. Waking up now in your own apartment, your new apartment. Your pager is buzzing and vibrating both. Serious. It is in fact the weekend, but you're not in elementary school. No one is crawling in through the window. You're assistant administrator for Inware. Waking up urgently. Here in Intopia. Home. The constellations on the ceiling are as you left them. Pisces, Cetus, Aquarius, and the ones without celestial referent, left by some crazed astronomer in residence here before you. What could you call them? The cradle, the way, the burning book. They're still glowing, too. Must not have napped for long. We have an interactor to continue.
Will you show us how to work it?
I will if someone comes up to assist me.
I'll use if you would.
I will do.
I mean, I don't mind being a kind of guinea pig.
So just sit down and type something to do.
It's connected, just.
Walk. To go anywhere, it's necessary to specify the compass direction to go in, or a nearby place to go. There aren't any obvious exits from this place. The pager buzzes and jars you, its motor driven to disrupt and demand attention. This is no Harry Potter broomstick. Watch, that is, watch the pager. It's too dark to see, like inside of a dog. the pager vibrates like it's repeatedly tapping you to get your attention, and it buzzes gratingly. Light, that is, light the pager. Optical discs are the only thing you know how to burn. The buzzing of the pager continues. You are toothed to the dental drill of the device. Let me invite also the audience to yell out suggestions to our hapless interactive.
Huh?
Destroy, that is destroy the pager. If you only knew how to attack a problem like this one. Mwah, the pager, the pager, the pager, make it stop.
Rebuild.
Curl up and cry. That verb doesn't seem to be part of your API, metaphorically speaking. That is, that verb won't be understood. Try something else, or phrase that command differently. Just cry.
You just use cry, no?
Cry. You allow yourself a moment to get in touch with your inner screaming maniac. You return to lucidity for what is going to be a very brief moment unless you make the pager stop buzzing and vibrating.
Okay.
What about calm?
Above?
Calm. C-A-L-M.
C-A-R.
L. One L.
Call. That is, call yourself. It seems you want
Calm.
to engage in some sort of social or communicative behavior. A novelty for you, really, and not easy. If you want to talk to someone, though, you can do that by just asking or telling that person about something specific. The pager, it hurts us.
Turn the light on.
That's one word.
Turn the light on. You switch the light on. The pager's buzzing and vibration seems to have set up a sort of resonance in your body, which reacts like the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Do they have that video here in the UK also? That's a very famous physics class video, which was supposed to demonstrate resonance.
We had the same problem here. The bridge was closed down because everyone was walking at the same pace across the
Yeah.
bridge. Yeah.
Millennium Bridge.
Yeah, Millennium Bridge, that's it.
Well, thanks very much, I have to say, for I subjected you to an alien work of interactive fiction, a foreign keyboard, and you showed some of how an interaction might start off. And in this case, there's a, one of the things we could do if we had, now that we know that turning on the light is an option, right? Since through long struggle we discovered that. Right? We could start off by doing that, and at a point where we're not about to be slain by our communications device, and then we see some things around here. If we examine the pager, right, then we get some more information here, including, for instance, that if you press the gray button, you'll play any voice messages that you have, right? So this is telling you how to operate the pager. And then we can do that. We can also, one of the things, quite pleasingly, a tester of this found out, is that you can just drop the pager, and you can, in that case, just stand up off the couch and leave the room and walk away and not worry about any of that. That'll come back to haunt you later on, but that would be one way of temporarily dispatching the problem of the pager. And what's happening here, even if it isn't exactly clear why one would go through all of this and what the virtues of doing so are. Right now I'm just commanding this character to move around. I've gotten outside into a city, and I'm witnessing different things here in the city. There's even a nostalgic moment where I remember first moving in, which wasn't very long ago, actually. So we see there's different types of, we might have a puzzle solving activity that's motivated by an immediate crisis, but we might also have exploration that goes on. But one thing I want to mention is that this isn't a hypertextual sort of system where we click on a word and we go and look at a text. It's rather a system in which a character, for instance, has a fiercely buzzing pager or not, threatening their life or not. And what happens as a result of an underlying simulated world. The character is in a certain location. Other things may be in the location as well. A character may have a laptop that was picked up, and that laptop may be commenting on things that are going on as he or she explores the world. And it's not exactly like things we experience on the web or in Flash games, but I hope that you can at least see that some of that difference stems from there being this underlying simulation. And we can look at this further. If you have some specific questions about book and volume, I'd be glad to talk about those, but I suppose I'll move to...
So every single thing that you ask in the story can affect what happens next to the next action. So that's essentially what you're saying, aren't you? That
Yeah.
everything affects the state of the system.
That's right. There may be things, for instance, if you're sitting around, looking around at things, that may make no difference whatsoever what you choose to look at. It's just that you'll be, as a player, you'll be presented with one piece of text or another. But you can also take actions that do change the ontological status of the world, what is going on in that world. If you're rude to a character, that character may react differently to you than if you're polite or exceedingly obsequious, which these are options actually in Adam Cotter's Varicella that you can choose to talk to characters different ways.
Is this built like a location so that effectively things happen in different places, and once you get there through words, then you get the text? So could that be conceivable in real location, like a locative piece?
Well, that's right. Although a lot of what happens in interactive fiction is made feasible because it's all contained within the system. So, for instance, if we went to a real place that was modeled by our system and a fire truck pulled up and started hosing down a building, well, unless we had that, we would have to somehow deal with the fact that this has occurred in the real world, and our system may not have a model of that. So, so there are some interesting possibilities there, and perhaps the disjunction between what the model is and what the world is an opportunity rather than a barrier, but it does make for a difference from sort of standard interactive fiction.
But it's all completely predetermined script.
Well, in the sense that anytime you use your computer, everything that happens is predetermined. I mean, Microsoft Windows is also predetermined. Unfortunately, it crashes all the time. It's part of that. But also, even if you open up Microsoft Word and you start typing things, everything's predetermined. So,
News of a building exploding is not predetermined.
no, but that's not. I'm just talking about a computer program executing. Right. So that's right. And the question is maybe is your program something that did you create a predetermined system that's interesting to consider in connection to whatever's going on in the world, whatever those things may be, right? So let me move on to just close out this discussion of interactive fiction itself with some thoughts about where interactive fiction might go from these three sort of caricature eras that I mentioned, of mainframe, commercial, and independent. Right. So I'd certainly like, one of my hopes is to release an interactive fiction system that supports narrative variation. I haven't told you exactly what that means yet, but I will. And with that, there might be, I think, an era of narrating, of particular literary concern with the way that games like this express themselves. So perhaps we might see a piece of interactive fiction accepted as an MFA thesis. We might see, by around 2014, hundreds of interactive fiction works in different artistic festivals, literary magazines, maybe Xbox Live Arcade, maybe two of the three. I don't know the channels that, it could be through independent gaming, as well as through the art community that interactive fiction becomes of interest to people once more. And perhaps there'll be a special award, the Pulitzer Prize, that's given for interactive fiction, which did happen for comics. You know, Art Spiegelman in the U.S. was lauded by the Pulitzer Prize Committee this way. So it's not beyond imagination.
When you're saying actually IF all the time, I mean that sounds to me like as if. This is challenging actually possibilities of as if something, or what if I just put this word. Do you have anything? Does it have to do anything with the if? Because we in filmmaking and filmmaker, in directing filmmaking, we use a lot of if for the actors. Imagine if this situation was like this or like that. So
Yes, I think possibility, virtuality, these are things that are essential to creating an interactive fiction piece. If you wanted to have a system in which nothing happened, then it would be a lot of overhead to try to write that. The reason someone creates interactive fiction is to show maybe that there are different possibilities, there are different outcomes, that if you disobey your boss by not saying by not listening to his message on the page, or something bad will happen to you. But also working out things perhaps a little beyond that in terms of what would be a nice society to live in, what type of model of a city would allow us to think about that in a new way. So these are certainly issues as well. Mm-hmm.
Can I just ask about kind of envisaging a different kind of future? Because obviously what you're proposing with this whole practice, I mean, it's kind of out there. It's quite new, quite different, quite radical, and yet you kind of established categories that you're aiming for are kind of quite conservative. So in a way it's kind of disappointing, the future that you're envisaging for that interactive fiction. You wanted Pulitzer Prize for it, MAF theses, and I just think, why things so small and so narrow? Want interactive fiction? Well, no, but it's just kind of quite conservative institutions that have been around for a long time. Want the kind of changing narrative fiction, wanted to actually change the whole institution of literacy, of what counts as the author, and the whole kind of strategies and institutions of literacy, rather than just thinking, oh, please accept us in the canon of that.
Well, I think there's Pulitzer Prize winning literature, which is very good, and I don't think that it's made worse by having won that award, receiving that recognition, and people.
Sure, but it's very significant. The kinds of
there's certainly a variety of ways in which you could imagine interact. This is the range between saying that art festivals, literary magazines, and Xbox Live Arcade, which whether or not Xbox Live Arcade will be around in 2014 is another question. But whatever its successor might be, right? I think that it makes sense to think about how would this form be relevant? How would this form be interesting? The way that poets, many of them think about. Some just think, okay, that's fine. Only a handful of people care about poetry, and too bad for everyone else. Forget you. But some of them are interested in how it is that poetry might reach people. They do things that range from creating DVDs to teaching in prisons and so on. And so I think that it makes sense to envision these things. And I do think that the Pulitzer Prize is not the fact that they recognize comics, something that I think I may not have as close relation to comics as people who work in the form, but to me it doesn't seem like that's sort of like a brutal sellout type of thing. Like now I remember comics that are cool, and now the Pulitzer Prize.
I suppose, I just quick follow-up, because it wasn't a real question, we need to celebrate the underground and the grassroots. It wasn't that kind of question.
Yeah.
It was more about, to what extent do you envisage the kind of art practice or literary practice you're producing or involved with will change the broader institution of the book, the author, the kind of literary world, if you like?
Well, okay, so that's quite a question. I think that one of the issues is that one of the things that's interesting about interactive fiction is that it does demand a deep engagement, as Catherine Hales calls it, as opposed to the type of hyper-attention, you know, that we often think of, that we have in reading a book and really getting involved with and understanding and reading a novel. And this is one of the reasons I think that mobile phone interactive fiction is you know, really of little interest in the long term, because the context for it is not right for people. Unless people begin using their mobile phones as, you know, deep attention devices, then that's not a very good platform for work like this. So in a sense, I think one of the things that IF can offer, although it can offer a lot of radical and innovative things, it can also offer it can allow people to indulge that mode of deep attention that they have when it comes to books. And so I don't see it as a break from the book in that sense. In fact, I see interactive fiction when it was played in the early 1980s on home computers, which ran only one application at a time, which were not hooked up to the internet, right? Which actually focused someone on a particular experience. Right? That's actually in some ways more, you know, what the core of IF is like than seeing it even just in a window here as the only thing on the screen. So is it working a way toward an answer? I mean, I think it exists. This is a deep, complex issue of how interactive fiction might exist, right, in this entire culture, in this entire context of festivals, Pulitzer Prizes, and everything else. But I see it as repudiating some things, but certainly continuing others.
Actually, could I just follow on from that now that Jared started with this? Is it also a way of thinking through what might be the deep engagement as often being pursued in the singular? Is there something which allows for a different kind of collective or social networking of the interactive fiction reading scenarios that you would envisage could be another development? So that question of who is the author becomes quite a profound one.
Well, I think the issue with people playing interactive fiction in today's network context is it's much easier to collaborate and work together, interacting, to play interactive fiction together. Of course, it's easier to read poems together in remote locations, to do other sorts of things along these lines. So that's a virtue. If we, I don't mean to simply curse the network as a distraction. There are things that it does that are very, very helpful in that case.
Sorry, more following this, but maybe we'll never get to the end of the very last one. No, but just because I think I got slightly confused. When you speak about interactive fiction, do you always assume that it's a fiction which is consumed, if you want, in real time, i.e., you know, computer gives you something, I reply, I go ahead into this fiction, this narrative, or could it be the result of a collaboration, for example, of people at different moments? For example, we're all sending a text or collecting a photo, sending it somewhere. We maybe not being following the narrative in real time, but somewhere, maybe on the web, this collection of things become a narrative, which is therefore readable at a different time. So that, for me, would also be an interactive narrative, but it doesn't seem
it is an interactive narrative, and it's definitely, I endorse that as a legitimate mode of literary practice and good things to do. And I've done these activities myself, but the term interactive fiction specifically refers to a computer program of the sort I've shown, which during its execution takes input from a user. That's why it's interactive, and it simulates this fictional world. So that's, I mean, that's what everyone, all the people who I've shown you snippets from their work, Adam Cadre, Plotkin, Emily Short. And
that's where we're coming from, for sure.
I mean, well, that's the way the term is used by the people who create interactive fiction. I mean, the other people who create interactive fiction besides myself don't think that's interactive fiction. That's not the way we use the term or talk about it. We use it for something else. That is interactive narrative.
Okay.
I agree, but the term is here specifically referring to this simulated world portrayed in text, or at least in a system that's text-based. I'm showing you all text stuff. There is stuff that has sound, animation, images, but it's text-based in most cases. So,
But does that imply sort of monolithic structure of the problem perhaps react dynamically to unfolding events, for example, so it wasn't predetermined? I'm really interested in the way that you can make it a predetermined system. One way was at least to network it so it could react dynamically. That ruined the
yeah, I guess the thing is that the aesthetic, that all of the interesting work that's been done, so it doesn't rely on things being predetermined or not. I mean, you can incorporate, you can put, you can put a roll of the die into a piece of interactive fiction.
I mean, perhaps a learning capability so that it could learn from the input and change its response so that it wasn't predetermined. It was really purely not predetermined because it's learning from people using it. That's within the bounds of interactive fiction.
Possibly so.
Elastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Shifting the paradigm.
So good. And this is a good initial discussion. Interactive fiction is not it's not a simple topic. It's not that new. It's it's been around for more than 30 years, but it also doesn't appear in ways that are quite as transparent as internet radio stations, because of a smaller community of play, because of different types of computational complexity that are involved. So with that basic idea of what interactive fiction is, let me move on to what I'm interested in, why I'm interested in it. And I mentioned that what interactive fiction does very well is that it simulates this limited domain or micro-world. Right? And that's a virtue of interactive fiction. Now, it may cause problems if we want to hook it up to the world in a media sense, or think about breaking out from that and creating something that isn't predetermined and bound in this way. But it gives us a kernel to work with that's interesting to literary artists and game creators, and has produced something quite interesting so far. But the reason I mention this is because I want to emphasize again that interactive fiction is simulation. What we see is a simulation of a world. We see book and volume. There's a city that exists in a certain way. There's a character in that city. And we're not just looking at web pages. We couldn't accept in an absurd way that would involve millions of web pages. We couldn't put up a hypertext that did what book and volume does. And I'm not saying this out of arrogance for my beautiful creation. This is the case with all interactive fiction pieces, including the ones that I quoted from. Interactive fiction is virtual reality. And furthermore, it's good virtual reality. It does the job of simulating places, characters, and objects well. You can even simulate that there's a system of magic, or you can simulate technological artifacts that are operated, or you can simulate how a society works, how people move around in office, for instance. All of these things can be accomplished in interactive fiction and have been accomplished, because doing that modeling of the physical world is what Will Crowther and Don Woods accomplished back in 1976, really. That's been refined in various ways, but that's what distinguished that from other sorts of text-based games, hypertexts, and so on. And so simulating the physical world is really, even though I didn't spell excellence correctly, it's the excellence of interactive fiction. It's not a bottleneck in the practice of interactive fiction. So let me mention, just to be, again, very, very traditionalist, Pulitzer Prize loving, that there are works of literature, right, which people, including myself, think are very strong, very affecting, very provocative pieces. I mean, this is not something that's really a narrow group of academics. It's something that, I talk to game developers and they agree with me that these are great works of literature. let's see, I'll bring in some of this. We don't want all the ones on the page to have been published in Paris first. Why is it that these are interesting to us? Why have they endured or caught our attention? It's not just because of the events that they represent, I would say. It's not that we're interested in a paraphrase like, you know, let me tell you what happened in Hamlet. You can buy those books. I was looking at one in the bookstore the other day that just, you know, relate like all the events in Hamlet, basically. That's sort of missing the point, I think we would all agree. Right? There's something about the language, there's something about the way those events are related. And that's the case with all of these. It's not that we really want to know, you know, like whatever, masturbation at the beach or, you know, whatever things that are actually depicted in these novels. They're only interesting because of the way in which they're depicted. But it's in combination with the particular way that those stories are told, that the stories themselves become truly interesting to us. I would say that in the standpoint of a system, then what we are looking for is what might be called narrative variation. That we want to be able to not just change the underlying world around and move a character from one location to another, but actually change the way that the story is told, the way things are narrated. Now, to explain, right, at a very high level, in considering narrative theory, right, we can make a pretty useful distinction between expression, this level of expression or how a story is told, and then the level of content, what is told in a story. I don't like the word content, particularly with relationship to digital media, but this is a nice, fairly generic division, and it's interesting to think about. Now, Matt Madden, in this comic, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, which is actually strongly inspired by Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style, he presents this, this comic. And the panels depict male character, you know, standing up, walking into a room from the top of the spiral staircase. He hears, "What time is it?" Looking at his watch, he says, "It's 1:15. Thanks," as he's opening the refrigerator. And then he stares at the refrigerator and says, "What the hell was I looking for anyway?" Now, we might ask what the point of this story is, but it's a story of some sort, and it's portrayed here in the comic medium in this way. So the thing is that Matt Madden then goes on to draw the story 98 other ways, right? And here are two of them. If you look on the left, you'll notice that it basically using the conventions of comics, the way that speech bubbles are stacked up, the fact that Z's are coming out to show that he just, I guess, recently put the laptop into sleep mode and so on. Right? He tells this in one panel. And then on the right, he tells basically the same story. He adds sort of, you know, things like going to the bathroom and so on, but he tells basically the same story in 30 panels. Okay? And this is one example of how the same thing can be told in different ways. And it helps us to understand, even if you're looking at something that is actually only told in one way, like the novels or play that I was showing earlier, it helps us to understand that attunement to the possibility of these ways of narrating is important. So what are the things that can vary? Well, here's one model. This comes from Gerard Genet. This is from Figure-toi. The book is Narrative Discourse in English from 1980. And by analogy to grammar, but not meaning the same thing as grammar, Genet suggests that there's narrative tense, there's order, speed, and frequency, that there's narrative mood, there's a distance, how close or far away the narrator is to events. And there's focalization, something like perspective, although there's a reason that Genet prefers this term. And then there's narrative voice, the time of narrating and who the narrator and narratee are. So let's take these first three, order, speed, and frequency, and I'll try to explain briefly what they mean. We could have a story like this, which I appropriated from a British author. The king dies, the queen grieves, the queen dies, the clown usurps the throne, and the jester laughs. So these are 5 events. And in this the way I just told them, which is indicated in this top diagram, those 5 events are just expressed. They happen in that chronological order, and they're expressed one after the other, something which very rarely happens when it comes to stories, actually. Here's another way that I could express those same events. I could say, the king and queen died. The jester laughed after the clown usurped the throne. Right? So now the things I did were, there's a variation in order. I said first that the jester laughed and then that the clown usurped the throne, which even though this is a trivial example, you might imagine that changing your perspective on the story, because you might think, oh, that cruel jester, he's laughing at the king and queen's death, when really he's laughing at something else that happened. But because I told you these out of order, you may form a different perception. There's a variation in speed. Speed is how rapidly or slowly I pass over events. And if I want to pass over an event as rapidly as possible, I simply omit it. I did that with the queen's grief. The fact that the queen was grieving, I left out. And then there's a change in frequency. Frequency is when we decide to do something like narrate events singulatively, saying the king died and the queen died, or narrate multiple events as one. The king and queen died. Right? It's the difference between I went to bed early Monday, I went to bed early Tuesday, I went to bed early Wednesday, and for a long time I went to bed early. So these are some of the things that can vary, and they can vary to create different types of literary effects. As an example of what focalization and distance might mean, right here we have a comic of that same story by Matt Madden that is focalized through the male character. You see what the male character is looking at. The information that we're getting here is regulated. Right? So I mean, there's a sort of cinematic interpretation that the camera's on his head and so on. But the basic thing about focalization is that the narrator chooses only to say what the focalized character knows about. If in fact there is a focalized character, there can also be no focalization. And then in terms of distance, right now there's actually several things that are different here. This is sitting at a coffee house, the character's relating the story. So among other things, the main narrative, what was the main narrative, becomes an embedded narrative. Okay, so there's this narrative level that's different. But the thing I wanted to point out here is that we're much more distant from events, because we now have a narrator stuck in between what was happening, whereas we were seeing it before in all of these other cases. So that's a change in distance. I think I'll skip past this, but time of narrating is something that we might mistake as a simple grammatical change. It's a little more sophisticated than that. It involves how the narrator is positioned in time relative to events. So if I were to say, so I was in the hall and this guy came up to me, that would be my being positioned as narrator after the events. But I could say, so I'm in the hall and this guy comes up to me, and then I'm positioned simultaneous with events. The tense change is part of it, but not enough to understand what's going on in this case. So what I want to focus on here are two things, really sort of three things, but essentially order and focalization. I want to go over briefly how it is that the interactive fiction system I've developed deals with order and focalization and being able to automatically change these. It turns out that when you try to deal with order, you have to deal with time of narrating jointly. So this is something that Jeanette put actually in a separate category, but it turns out from the standpoint of generating, not from the standpoint of analysis, which Jeanette was trying to do, but generating text, you really have to deal with them together. So that's the story of how to actually make changes. The way that current interactive fiction systems work, the architecture of them is basically like this. There's a parser, that's the thing that interprets, go east or some other command and makes it into an intended action. It goes into the world model, the standard libraries, part of which is the specific story file and game. This is the basic idea. I mean, we can change things about the parser in the story file also. But essentially we have this type of chain. Command comes in, it goes through the world model, comes out. My system is actually far simpler. And I say that in some seriousness because it turns out that what an interactive fiction system inherently has to do is a bunch of different things. So if you put them all into a lump, it is actually more complex, even though the diagram looks simpler, than breaking them out. And let me try to explain what these modules do very briefly by explaining when you type in a command to my interactive fiction system, how it would be processed through here. So first of all, you type something like go east, turn on the light. And it comes into a preparer. This is doing tokenization, basically, figuring out what the words are. It's not even really specific to the language. It's sort of just a very early minor pre-treatment on that input. The recognizer here then, when I say specific to a language, what I mean, as you might expect, is that if you wanted to create one of these systems in French or Spanish, right, you need to change the recognizer. Right? It's what's doing the resolution of that a command like go east means, this particular character has the intention to travel by foot to the east, and so on. But the innovation here is that the simulator, which is the part that actually deals with the underlying world model, is separate, not only from the recognizer, but also from the narrator. And in fact is language independent. So for instance, whether a door is open or closed, you don't need to change the way that's modeled between English, Spanish, French. That's simply an underlying issue with the representation of a simulated world. Once that action is handed off, the simulator does what it needs to do in terms of saying, is the door now open? Did the character perish in an untimely way, and so on. And updates the world models. And then there's a separate module, again specific to a language, that narrates what has been done. So the way that text is produced in this system is not simply sort of a side effect that when we open a door, we throw off a message saying the door opens. Instead, we do everything that we need to update the state of the world, and the narrator can narrate after. Narrate things that have just happened. The narrator could do the then there's another sort of trivial module to shape this up into terminal output or HTML or whatever. But the critical new components of this system are the narrator module, the world models, and then the plan for narrating that says how shall we tell things? How shall we narrate? And then just so as to allay any puzzlement, the clarifier up there is the unit that is responsible for answering, for asking for clarification. If you say, for instance, something like sit in the chair, and there are several chairs around, you need to ask the user to disambiguate which chair. The joker is a unit that's responsible for dealing, it's like the joker in a deck of cards. It stands apart from the deck, and what it does is it deals with these meta sort of commands such as quit, restart, things that affect the game state but don't actually affect the simulated world. And so within the narrator, we have 3 modules which form an additional pipeline here. There's a reply planner that figures out at a high level what the content is going to be, how to select and structure what we're going to output. A microplanner that identifies what tense, aspect, and person we're actually going to have, and then the realizer transforms that into actual strings. Right? This is doing surface realization. So this is actually a standard natural language generation pipeline. And the microplanner here is taking this narrative information and figuring out how that actually maps to specific grammatical information about particular sentences. So if you're telling the story in the present tense, the time of narrating is simultaneous with the events, and you have a flashback, well, you don't keep telling that flashback in the present tense. You tell it in the past tense. So it needs to figure those things out and mark each of the sentences and each of the verbs appropriately and figure out how to do verb formation. So given the time, I think I'll try to skip pretty quickly through the discussion of order and focalization. But let me know if there's something that is, if I've said enough and you have a question, please do stop me. The problem, I mentioned one of the issues with changing order around. But here's another issue. How do we even represent order? Okay, so when we mix a story up, the basic idea is that the way Jeanette would say to represent this is just as a transformed sequence, 3, 4, 1, 2, 5, 6, instead of the original 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It turns out that there's a bunch of different reasons we might be jumbling those events. So we might have categorized things. This is a type of ordering scheme called solipsis. And we might be saying, okay, we want to have everything that happened in the kitchen, everything that happened on the street, everything that happened in the dining room. That might be the reason that we reordered these events. It might be that we just wanted to confuse people. If you've read Robbe-Grillet, you might have experienced something like this, right? Or on the other hand, we may actually be intending to have a flashback. We may say that there's this main sequence in which this thing is happening, but we've decided to flash back to these first two events, right? Those would all be reasons why we would jumble these things up. Well, it turns out the sequence is not, for generation purposes, enough to know which one of these to generate, to know what text to say. So instead, I've introduced this representation that's an order tree representation that gives the selective representation like this, a flat representation for acronym when you're just jumbling all the events up, and for analepsis, which, remember, as I was describing it, is a main sequence with stuff in the past. We have a representation that looks like this. And when we actually try to render that representation of analepsis, we have to figure out how to do it. And these internal nodes actually allow us to specify things about these points in time called reference and speech time, which Hans Reichenbach used to describe a theory of tense, so that we can go into, Reichenbach's basic idea is that if you have event time, when something happened, reference time, and speech time, that you can figure out what tense is needed from that. Okay, so for instance, if I were to say, let's say I want to say that hopefully I will have returned to Cambridge by midnight. My reference time is midnight. The event that I'm talking about is my return to Cambridge, which happens before that. But both of those things are in the future because my time of speaking is now. And similarly, if I were to say, hopefully this turgid grammatical discussion will end soon, that in that case, the end of the discussion is the event time is the same as the reference time. So we have a different tense, the simple future rather than the anterior future. The nice thing about this scheme is that, well, all events that are being simulated, we already know what time they occur. That's part of the model of the simulated world. That's one of the things that interactive fiction does pretty well to begin with. And so now we can annotate things about their speech and reference time and automatically generate, for instance, that this sequence needs to be in the past while these things are in the present. We can even use this structure to add, right? This is so we have different relationship between event, reference, and speech time for the top level and the bottom level. And we can also use that tree to add things like, yesterday, anyway, that are words that cue us going into a different sequence and coming up out of it. And this works with all the different structures. So here, everything would be told in the present tense, which is exactly what we're looking for because we want to confuse people as much as possible about the order in which events occurred. If you change and narrate events that happened in the future instead of the past, things work as you like, and you get the correct tense there as well. All right. Focalization is the other thing I wanted to mention, this concept of regulating information through a particular. And the way this is modeled in the system is we have, following Orion's terminology in dealing with fictional worlds, an fiction actual world. This is not saying that it is the real world, as far as we're concerned, but as far as the characters are concerned in the interactive fiction, it's the real world. That's what the simulator actually deals with. That's what says, is a door open or closed? And it's going to be one way or the other. Now, all of these focalizer worlds are different characters' models of that world, based on their knowledge and perception. They can be preloaded with knowledge at the beginning of the game, and they can perceive things as they go about. So these are sort of different things. The IF actual world is complete, correct, and current, right? Because the reason I say this is, it is what you were modeling. It's like a sentence being an accurate model of itself. That's it. You might not have done what you wanted, but it's a complete model. The focalizer world, on the other hand, is almost certainly incomplete. Who's going to know everything about the state of the world? It could be wrong. Characters could just believe the wrong things about the world. And also, importantly, unlike the actual world, it has to have history. Because if you don't maintain previous states of that world, those characters can't talk about the past. I would be deluded into saying something like, oh, when I walked into this room, it was full of people. Because my only model of this room is what I see right now. I have to maintain a model of the past in which I walked into the room and there weren't people filling it, right? Otherwise, I won't be able to narrate properly. So all of these things are needed. This is a piece I'm going to show you briefly. But this is an example of how our perception might be affected by where we are. And in this case, what happens if you start this demo, which I'm going to show you, called Lost One, you type look. One of the things you should see is this text right here. A bunch of things happen, but one of them is the trash collector picks up something. Now in this simulated world, your character is in the middle of a plaza and sees a trash collector at another location. From here, you see in the distance a trash collector to the southwest. Right? So the trash collector standing off to the southwest says the trash collector picks up something. Now, if instead of standing there in the middle, we walked off to the southwest, we would see this. The trash collector picks up the candy wrapper. I can tell I haven't impressed anyone with this difference yet. But the thing about this is that in order to, this is very interesting, you know, in interactive fiction to look at this, the trash collector picks up the candy wrapper. Well, the character perceived the trash collector, perceived the action of picking something up, and perceived the candy wrapper. It's all there. The character sees the same thing essentially that was in the IF actual world. There's no difference. Here, something curious has happened. The character perceived the trash collector and perceived the action that the trash collector is picking something up, but didn't see what that small thing was that the trash collector is picking up. So the way in which the focalizer's world is incomplete is not even, it doesn't have these clean breaks of like, I either see an entire action or I see nothing. It can also see partial actions. Here's another thing we can do, right? This is an implementation of adventure, the first interactive fiction that I showed you a bit of in my IF system. Right? So what we see here is that when we start off, this is walking out of the building. the only thing that the adventurer has explored is that building. The adventurer went in, and the adventurers come out of the building, and it says east is the building's interior as the last piece of information. Okay? Well, that's because the adventurer is naive. The adventurer does not know anything about the landscape, the environment. If we had a different adventurer that we load with knowledge, such that this adventurer knows everything about the environment, where things are, we would get a different response coming out of the building. South is the valley, up is a hill and road, north is the forest, east is the building's interior. Right? So the difference between, the difference here is not perception, it's the knowledge that's there to begin with. Of course, we can also give the adventurer the wrong knowledge, right? The adventurer could be deluded into thinking that you can go to the south, but in fact there's a wall there. What will happen? The command will be understood as an intent to go south. The adventurer will move to the south, but when that action is executed, it's not executed against the focalizer's model, against the adventurer's fantasy of what the world is like. It's executed against the actual world. So they run into the wall. Here is another interesting bit of narration. This is actually recounting everything that the adventurer has seen. Now, this is a somewhat different version of adventure in which to make things interesting, I stuck the pirate of the dwarf up in the initial area, making some modifications. But I'm not. My goal here was not to make things authentic, but to make them interesting. So here, all of these things have happened when we recount from the adventurer's perspective. And you notice that even though this is a standard second person, you were standing at the end of a brick road narrative, when we recount things, everything's in the past tense, as it should be, because all these things have already happened. Now, here's another version of those same events. And this is a version from whose perspective? The pirate's perspective, yes. Right. So here, the pirate, in fact, is having a much less interesting life. Standing at the end of the road, just waving. Occasionally a dwarf walks up. But, that's about it. The adventurer doesn't know, you don't see and hear this information about the dwarf, going to end of road and meeting the pirate, because the adventurer doesn't see that. That's happening somewhere else. Similarly, the pirate over here doesn't know all this interesting stuff that's going on. He just sees the adventurer go into a building, come out of a building, and walk off to the south. Right? But there's all these other things, opening a grate and going into the cave, getting the equipment earlier on. So these are some possibilities, and let me just show you what I have. This is really a demo in the sense of something to show. I don't know that it's interesting for anyone to play, but it does show how it is that narrative variation can be accomplished, and maybe it shows something about how it might be interesting in an interactive situation in the game. This is Lost One. The sun hits the plaza. Now they drive cars, seeking flat packs across the sprawl. Once they were supposed to cluster here. You have arrived, visitor to this place where you briefly lived years ago, where you knew spaces and faces, now almost forgotten. There is one here less lost to you than the others, though, and it is right here in this plaza, about now, that you are to meet him, somewhere right around here. All right, so there's basically two strategies that I know of for meeting people in public places, one of which involves staying put and hoping that they will show up and find you, and the other involves running around looking for them. This is modulo mobile phones. Okay, so what I'm going to do is simply, look. You look at the center of the plaza. Your senses are humming as you view the broad, circular, encircling plaza of the Americas. The morning has concluded. It is midday now. You see that the center of the plaza contains a flaneur. From here, you see in the distance a statue to the north, a fountain to the east, a trash collector to the southwest, a boy to the northeast, an obelisk to the south, and some punk and a tree to the west. The flaneur goes to the northern area. The punk kicks the tree. The boy throws a ball. The trash collector takes something. The ball falls to the ground. And we can do things as we sit around, look at the ball. You look at the ball, you see a baseball, the boy takes the ball. The trash collector walks to the western area. Look at the flaneur. You see a man who seems dedicated to strolling about. The trash collector picks up something. Look at the statue. You see a marble likeness of Einstein. There's almost no hint here of the playful, disheveled scientist that was seen in photographs that were popular in the early 21st century. The flaneur wanders around briefly. So it turns out, I could keep reading, but we just wait around. We have a very unexciting happy ending. Our friend shows up, and that's it. So that's the control. And I'll show you another option, which is what if we start running around, looking at things, not staying put. And I'll start by, we could go to the southwest so we could see that.
So in a sense, there could be an end.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I see one.
Yes. Well, we saw it. We saw an end. We saw an end of book and volume, but perhaps it was less satisfying. Although this one is very satisfying.
An end is the same as resolution.
No. I'm just wondering if there was an end.
So here I went to the southwest just so we could see what the trash collector is picking up, the candy wrapper. And I'll keep going. And you notice that the way this is told is actually very conventional of interactive fiction. It's told in the second person. In other words, the narratee of the story is the player character, and the story is addressed to that character. And the time of narrating is simultaneous with events.
So it's a bit like moving through a 3D world without visuals. Through words.
Yeah,
And
well,
just
whether that's right. So, you would have to actually create a 3D or 2D system that showed this graphically. You need to do a lot of different things. For instance, if I were modeling how it is that this were set up, I would say there's a computer on a table. There's a bottle of water on a table. Now, we don't want to get into modeling a bottle of water because it's very tricky, both for computer graphics and for interactive fiction, to have liquids to deal with. But you have a setup like this. Really, the important relations that I need to know are that these two things are on the table. If I'm going to tell you about them, those are the things I would say. At most, if the adjacency information is important because one's going to knock the other over or something. But I have to know all sorts of other things if I'm creating a 3D world that involve exactly the orientation and position of all of these objects and how far open these are and what the albedo of the surface is. All of these things. So
The question is, in which sense all of this is interactive? My sensation is that we are not that far away from the first adventure. We are still just moving in an environment, made of worlds, in which everything has been chosen for us. From a storytelling point of view, I don't think that it's that we can take for granted that there is a story and there is a way in which we told it. The way in which we told the story actually changes a lot of the story itself. The example of the Queen and King, for example, the example that you did before. If I don't know that the Queen died, and I think that the King and the Queen died at the same moment, I don't know that the Queen used to love his King, for example.
yes.
While if you say me that the Queen died, I know that the Queen used to love his King. I hear more information about the characters, but the characters themselves are changed.
Yes, well, that's the whole point
No, but
of
what
my
they say-
discussion as well.
Yeah,
What I'm saying is in fact, at this level, right, these things are very important issues. The way that the expression is connected
No, but
is
my problem is-
extremely important, and
my
the
problem is-
reason that I'm distinguishing expression and content is because it makes it easier to discuss it rather than harder. Not because there's some underlying.
No, but
True.
I get this point. My main problem is that if I look at ball, for example, perhaps I'm interested in.
Well, so
in
let's
a
not
story.
talk. You have not seen the point of this demonstration. So until I show it to you, I really would rather that we actually look at what I'm trying to demonstrate, because looking at a ball is something that, yeah, you're right, that's been done since 1976. There's nothing to talk about. I want to show you some of my research and how it influences this. I mean, it's a great move, and we should still be, writing interactive fiction where you look at stuff. Even though it happened back in 1976, there's still lots to be done there. But what I'm trying to add to the very effective and provocative set of capabilities that we have is along somewhat different lines. So, for instance, if we were to, my point simply being here, that if we run around, and I'm just showing you the difference between running around versus staying put. That something changes. That actually, we're now somehow in the past tense. Right? The narration of events is no longer simultaneous, but it's actually subsequent to the action. Right? The ball fell to the ground. Right? Whereas earlier on, the ball falls to the ground. Right? As we continue to move around, there's other changes. In fact, one of the things that happens is that we no longer have the visitor, the sort of adventurer character, as the narratee. We just see the visitor walk to the center of the plaza. That's told in the third person, in the past tense. And in fact, the order in which events are told changes at this point. As we continue moving around, we see the most recent thing that happens, the trash collector picking up the plastic scrap, and then these other things that have happened in reverse order, sort of memento style, although on a very small scale. And here,
Yes, but will this happen if I try to punch the punk, for example?
well, that's the thing, that punching the punk is something that, again, it's been done since 1976. So what I'm showing is the distinction between two courses of action. One is staying put and one is wandering around. You could, and that these courses of action here are influencing the telling of what goes on. Now, the system, I can promise you, supports a change in the plan for narrating upon assault on the punk. If you want to make something happen with the narrative of the story, not with the underlying world, when you begin to wail on the punk, when you begin to become aggressive or whatever else, that's perfectly fine. In this case, what I'm showing is really an unchanging underlying world in which these are deterministic things that are happening. These characters are moving around. But based on your action, what I like to think is happening is that the narration is getting more and more distant. There's words and confusion that's coming in, hesitation, pauses related to memory. And eventually what happens is that we don't have interactive control over the character at all. The wanderings of that character are taken over by the computer. And so instead of the simple ending, this makes things as distant as possible from us. We not only are being spoken to through layers that suggest that the events are far away, but we actually don't even get to participate in them anymore.
this also make actually going as if you were really moving around from north then to south, so you actually, the time has gone as well, so it's talking more from the past, using more of the past tense, since you've been actually just walking around the plaza.
That's right, but that change happened earlier, yes.
Yeah, so you start from the present, wherever you go to is sort of present, and then it's going to be past participle, and then it's going to be past, and it's going to be farther back into the past.
Yeah, the idea is to increase the distance. Yes. So one of the ways to do that is to not say, if I were telling a story, for instance, if I were to say like you're going to get run over by a car if you step in the street, right? That's pretty immediate. If I say one who steps in the street is likely to get run over by a car, that's a little bit more distant, right? It doesn't have the same effect as addressing you directly. So the narrative here goes from, aside from the change in tense, it also goes from being addressed to the you to simply mentioning the visitor, right? And so these things, I mean, in no way, I think there's all of the possibilities of interactive fiction, right, as they stand, the systems that have been created and the work that people have done, really is very good. I don't think that the limit, to me, I don't see the limits in that something is the separate simulation, that things are predetermined. These systems are still interesting to interact with. They can be very inviting, provocative. They can be transformative. But I also want to engage something. Now, you noticed when I showed you book and volume, one of the things I gestured to on the screen, I don't know if you got to take a look at it, was that there was a flashback, right? There was a flashback in book and volume. And of course, you can write flashbacks in interactive fiction, but they sort of occur the same way that they would in a cutscene in a game, right? We don't have a simulated flashback. We have some text that I wrote that occurs at that point. So there are ways, and the effective interactive fiction that exists today uses these ways of bringing in these types of effects. It's not that I'm inventing the idea of telling things out of order for interactive fiction. It hasn't ever been done before. It's been done plenty of times, but I'm trying to broaden the possibilities for authors to use that.
Can I please ask what's behind that? Because it's not clear. What have you authored, and what is the thing that is generated by software?
Sure. There is. I mean, I can.
So what I'm interested in, what are the building blocks of your story? Are there sentences? Are there words?
Yes.
How is
okay, the way that, let's see here. Let me open up, I'll open up actually, this is the code for the plaza environment right here. And obviously there's a bunch of other code that is in the IF system itself. And there's also another file, even for this very small trivial game. But this shows, how the places on the plaza, such as the center of the plaza. Well, I was just trying to find the center of the plaza. That's not going to help me. Okay, well, so these are the types of things. We have. There's a class thing, one of the three classes. The others are room and actor, right? And here we want there to be an object of class thing, and it's going to be the fountain. The fountain is one of these things that is there around in the park. It's it's in the part relationship. It is a part of the park, which means you can't pick it up and carry it off. It's called fountain, and we can refer to it as. These are for input. We can refer to it as rectangular, plane, noun, base, and jet. And that's the string. In this case, not a very interesting one for the appearance of it. And then one thing that the plaza has, if you don't give things a prominence, they just have the default prominence, which is 0.5. But the fountain is a large object, and so it has a high prominence. So in fact, you can see it even if you're standing across the plaza. Because and people, this is the reason that one can see a trash collector picking up a candy wrapper, and one can't see a candy wrapper in some cases.
So me as well, you were saying that this going farther back in the past. How far will this go actually? Will it keep on telling you like in the prehistoric times what this kind of family.
No, well, this is no. What I mean, I don't mean that it's continually going back, but part of the point is to make it more distant. So here, what this is telling is the way I have modeled this is simply that we are hearing the story of the visitor wandering around, the visitor who we no longer control, who continues to wander around in this park, and will continue no matter what we do, because we have, unless we interrupt the program, because we don't have the ability to.
Actually, I've got to be honest to you, from my point of view, it sounds boring.
Well, I'm not suggesting that you actually sit and spend a lot of time with this text.
Just widening actually this action and just being put up, so you can actually start looking for a red jumper, or you can actually do anything else, and you can actually get out of this plaza and just go somewhere else. So the potential is there. I see the bit to me without knowing anything about the inside of the computer thing. It sounds a bit boring because it's not really fully developed, but I think it's very interesting.
Well, this is not, I'm not suggesting that it would be interesting to play, but the point is that we can make the system go in different directions. We can begin narrating in different directions. And also, I mean to suggest that maybe there's a reason we would want to. Right? If all we wanted to do was like mention a thing that happened a long time in the past at a certain place, there's no point in building this huge apparatus. We just put in the text to do it, that's fine. So the question is, like, is there any reason we would want to bother changing, we would want to bother varying the narrative based on something that the interactor is doing? Because this is in effect, I didn't issue a command saying, you know, become more distant, use past tense, stop talking to me as a narrative. You know, it did that as a result of my action, of moving around.
Would you be kind to show us some of the production rules or inference rules that do that, just a snippet of the code, or if it's difficult?
Oh yeah, no, I mean it's, no, I'm not sure it's interesting, but it's not too difficult. I can open up. Okay. So this is it, I guess, right here. Right. So this is the distance, and what's happening is. Oh well. Okay. What this is doing is, this is saying. This is what actually changes the plan for narration, makes things more distant. When you tell it, when you give it a value, and you say, you know, the distance is such. So one of the things it does is it picks from this list of suffixes and prefixes, right? Things like, you know, apparently, evidently, or so it seemed, if memory serves, perhaps, right? And then other things that it does are just that as it goes along, it's going to adjust. Oh no, this is actually just the filter, right? So this is not making a change to the underlying plan for the narrative. What it's doing is it's on top of a sentence. It's adding things like this. So this is the piece that does that part of the work. And
if you were to feed a different word, do you have to change these rules as well? Or
no.
They're general.
They're general, yeah.
General.
Yeah, you can use these filters are entirely general. I mean, there's even, I mean, these are things that they're not the main point here, but they're fun to look at sometimes. Oops.
I think I got the idea. Thank you very much.
Okay.
If I could just interject for a minute, you've been very generous. You've spoken for about an hour and really 20 minutes, and we have interjected.
I wasn't speaking for much of that time. There were questions.
No, I know. When you had an attentive audience that was interrupting, it's sort of discursive, which is what this should be about.
No,
You're interrupting,
very
but
glad.
discursive. But for the last 15 minutes, do you think anyone would have specific questions? If you feel you've come to an end and a resolution, would that be okay? Just
sure.
So anyone else who hasn't spoken, Maria is keen to interject.
It might be a silly question, it's just ignore me. But what exactly would be the difference between what you've just presented, which is very interesting, and MUDs and MOOCs? So multi-user dungeons with auto-created MUDs.
So
I'm into performance, and I used to watch performances that were text-based in MUDs that linear, but networked.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's two questions. I mean, first of all, my research isn't to create narrative variation. There's a question about that, but there's also just a question, what's the difference between a MUD or MOO and interactive fiction? Right? So,
yes, I'm intrigued by the fact that you kind of, that you appear to be quite clear about what interactive fiction is. But I'm not, because I've been to different presentations and people speak about electronic literature or they use different terms. For some things that seem to be very overlapping and interconnected and related. So I'm intrigued by the fact that you use this term and seem to be quite specific about it. But I see it relating to lots of other things. And so
well, I mean, interactive fiction is a form that has a community of practice around it. So, I mean, there are people who create interactive fiction. They talk about it with each other. They share it with each other. They play it. They have an interactive fiction contest every year, a competition, right? And so it's not just my self-righteousness, but there's a group of people who do this work, and they're doing work. It is a certain type of work. They have a name for it, and so that's what it's called to those of us who do interactive fiction.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that.
A multi-user version of the game Dungeon, which is a Fortran port of Zork, which is an interactive fiction. So essentially, right, the multi-user Dungeon is a generalization, a more powerful form of interactive fiction that can support many people coming and playing it. Now, so if you were to look at it strictly in the sense, of oh well, MUDs seem to be a superset of IF. IF is for one player, MUDs are for however many players, but they're the same. Then you might think, well, what's the point? Why bother with interactive fiction when you can have MUDs? It turns out though that there are different settings where people socialize on a MUD. They have different sorts of values. They construct quests that may have functions within the community of people who play there, right? So and the fact that on the other hand they don't, as far as my experience has shown me, actually sort of apprehend and engage with the riddle-like literary objects in the way that people who are playing interactive fiction do. So I think that there are two branches, MUDs, which are sort of formally more general and more powerful because they're the same thing but with interactive fiction and multiple players. But MUDs are very socially oriented, and IF offers people can play interactive fiction together, of course, but it sort of offers the essential engagement of having a dialogue with the computer in this particular way in which it tells a story. So,
when will your system be be available to test and can we call it the expanded system of interactive fiction? Is it something of the next generation of interactive fiction?
well, I'd love, or a next generation or a next idea. I mean, people are very active developing new systems, and there's been the work that's gone into Inform 7 is very formidable. But people have different goals. Some people want to model clay, and how can you pull off pieces of clay and create things with it and still have it be represented by the system and so on. It's a fascinating problem, but not one that I think the literary future of interactive fiction hinges upon. Well, that's a way of avoiding saying when my system's going to be available. I'm hoping that it will be available in a year. I'm really trying just now. This is a sort of opportunity for me to bring myself back into work on the system after having worked on this platform studies project for a while. So I'm interested in getting it together within the next year. If I thought it's right now sort of, I'm the only person who's ever used this code. It does these things. I can demonstrate certain things about my approach with it, but I don't think it would be useful to offer up at this point.
A name already?
It had a name. I used to call it in, but either written or spoken, no one can understand what those tokens mean. So So I'm probably going to call it something else.
Because I was, if I could just a quick observation, when you were showing these inverted commas great works of literature, and Ulysses, I mean, it's interesting that
Yes.
that really has to be spoken, seems to me, because of the rhythm and the pattern. And how does that, or could that potentially come into your interactive system, that there is that rhythm, that sound, that aspect, or is that something you're not particularly interested in pursuing?
Oh, I'm quite interested, but I actually, I think those are questions I sort of address more in I've done some work on very small poetry generators, 256 character poetry generators, for instance, and that's something that no, I think it's an important issue. And of course, it's not that you need the audiobook of Ulysses, but that the process of reading it, certainly Finnegan's Wake, right, is very involved with reading with your ear. And,
absolutely, that's really what I'm trying to refer to.
Yeah,
Really
no, I don't. I think, I mean, if it can survive, going through a book, there's no reason why it couldn't through a computer. I think, in terms of presenting you with the text and being something that's of interest.
The writer and creator Chris Crawford is really adamant that interactive fiction and games cannot be part of the same domain, and I don't quite understand fully his objection. Do you have any insight into were you aware of that?
Well, I think Chris's perspective comes from, can't help but come from his involvement in the game industry, right, and his interest in interactive fiction apart from that. I mean, I'm not very interested in almost all industrial video game production, although there's some things that are quite nice. But I don't see a need to. There are all these walls that are built. I mean, I mentioned things about interactive fiction not being hypertext, which I think is important on a formal level. But I'm certainly not one for building, barriers between interactive fiction and games, interactive fiction and hypertext, and saying, these things must not touch one another. They must not be considered. No, I think actually that there, literary hypertext and certain literary interactive fiction pieces are united by their interest in language and how it can be transformed in interactive computer systems of two different sorts, but nevertheless, two different systems of that sort. And I think I don't see, I don't see a particular place for interactive fiction in the game industry, but I also don't see a contradiction between interactive fiction and game.
Me too, I don't fully understand why he's so adamant about it.
I'm interested in how labour intensive this is, because obviously you're doing a lot of work to set up the code just now, but in a way it saves you the time of having to write, say, I'm interested in the fact that if you're doing interactive fiction, you've got 10 different narratives could come out, for example, of one interaction, and then if you design the code now, then can you apply the same code to future ones, so it cuts down how much you have to write. When you're writing an interactive fiction story, what's the creativity in it? How do you decide how many options you're going to give? Like, or does it sort of take over? That's a rambling question, but I mean.
Sure. There's certainly, you can use libraries if you want to do standard, like, you'd like something to correct the spelling when people type in things and they transpose two letters. Obviously, you don't have to write that every time. And then when it gets to more specific sorts of things, like, for instance, maybe you'd like to have a facility that's not built into the system to be able to remember things, right? Okay, well, if someone has created that and you're happy with how it's done, you can use that in that case. But there's still the basic job of building the world and determining the way that things will behave and operate within it. And there's not always that much you can borrow when it comes to that. There's a good deal of work involved. It's not a process of listing the actions that are possible, though. It's really a process of saying, for instance, like, I'm going to simulate that there's a computer that can be turned on and off, and there's certain things I can certain things that one can do with it. And maybe it has a battery life, so that if it's unplugged for a period of time, the battery will drain down. And, it'll be off after that, right? And I build these things up, and then obviously you do have to anticipate as an author the types of things that people will do and provide for pleasurable interaction. But it's in the context of having a world like that in which, okay, now there's a problem that can be solved by using a laptop.
That's like you're talking about code there. What I'm interested in is the creative side, because your intention, it seems, is to create a richer experience for interactive fiction, and it's what you're trying to do is you're trying to achieve less labour in the future for yourself. If you design a system which sounds much more sophisticated, is this going to free you up so that you can focus much more on the literary content?
Well, I think that it's not so much that that a sequence of words is the literary content of these pieces, either the sequence that I write in a string that goes in here, or the sequence that appears, really. But it's how the words work in the context of user interaction and in this, the whole setting in that environment. So I could say, in a sense, I'm trying to create more work for myself and other interactive fiction authors, because just the same way that interactive fiction 1976, right, as it's originally conceptualized, is more work than just to, well, what else would you do? Write a textual description of a cave, or maybe write it's maybe a little anachronistic to think you do this in 1976, but write a hyperlinked, description of the cave where you can move between different places. But that would be less work. More work is actually creating a simulation where there's treasures, there's problems you have to solve, there's characters who move around and appear. And so I want to create even more work, which is the ability to transform the way that the telling of the story is told, the way the narration is done. But I think that it'll be worthwhile, just as I think it was worthwhile for interactive fiction originally to offer the power of simulating a world.
So it's your, the perspective is that the value for interactive fiction as a medium for user is more in the interaction and expression than
Yeah. Or I mean, there's expression, and then there's also, right, there's concept. Like I might, for instance, if I wanted to, one thing you can do, which I've tried to do, is to create environments which make you think about the way that society is, the way that industrialized, Western society, and the way cities exist. And so, and it's not always that there's something I need to say about that, and I'm going to express myself, but rather that, I think, there are things which more or less, in different ways, I think are sort of true in representing different aspects of these societies. And I'd like people to go into a system where they can experience that, play around with those things. It certainly has my own expression, my own perception, my own ideas in it. But it's not that that I need to get through some traumatic childhood experience or something. It's really that I want to offer, a simulation that's interesting.
There's a question over there. You've been waiting a long time.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm just trying to wrap up in my head and understand. So, because I'm probably more used to interactive narrative than fiction, so I'm trying to. So, from what I understand, on one side you're interested in text, and you're interested in the simulation aspect of interactive fiction. And what you're trying to do, from what I understand, is to make the narrator, which is the system, more interesting than what it's been so far.
Yes,
so
yes, exactly.
putting back ideas coming from Jean Genet about, what is an interesting narrative.
Yeah.
Now, if I got this right, then my question is, somehow, what is the point of trying to have a computer to be as good as us, since we know that somehow we can tell those stories because we have assimilated all the, the narrative tricks? I mean, is the interesting bit not about trying to have the computer to do the things that we don't know how to do? Because to try to have it as clever as us is, it's a matter of time, wait another century and probably will happen, or at least, or maybe not. But what I'm saying is, there are lots of things that a computer can already do that do not belong to the things that we can do as, because we haven't developed in our history. And maybe there are other possibilities which are actually quite exciting, and they're still part of narrative.
Yes, I think some of those would be good to pursue, I'm sure, but also one of the functions of the computer is as a medium, not just as an amazing device for doing that which goes beyond human reach. But for instance, in some ways, Will Crowther creating Dungeons and Dragons was creating adventure was encapsulating a dungeon master from Dungeons and Dragons. A person might sit down and say those things in playing a game, right? And so, well, first of all, not everyone can have their own dungeon master that they bring out to the table and they play Dungeons and Dragons all the time. So it's handy to have that. But also, when you make that into a computer program, there are then things that you can do. There are those things that you can do. The framework is that of a person, right? But the framework is that of a dialogue, just like having a chatterbot, for instance. So there's some that are very helpful because they have prodigious memories that people don't, and they can be used on MUDs and MOOs and in social situations where you might want to know something about the history of the MUD or about people. And they can be convenient, they can serve like a reference, but they can have an interface like a person, right? So I think that that's the type of thing. It's true that any of these particular dimensions that I'm looking at are things that we observe in literary texts. I didn't look to go beyond that because we haven't even gotten those yet. But I think once we put these in, that we'll be able to explore that territory as well and to go beyond. We won't be limited by the framework because there are things, you play interactive fiction, like some of these that I quoted from, they're nothing like what a dungeon master sitting down would tell you, right? They've exceeded that early concept of what interactive fiction might be, right? In very powerful, affecting ways. And so I think that when you provide this new capability, when you provide the ability to look at how a narrator can work automatically, you do have the option to still question what the computer can do that goes beyond it.
Can we have just maybe 2 last questions so we can finish on time and you can eat something? Thank you.
I just wanted to ask you, just sort of carrying on from what this guy here said, when you showed us your demo and it sort of went off into sort of automatic pilot mode, making its own version of the story, have you ever thought of a way of trying to pick out a good story automatically from all of those that have been generated? Some sort of quality control, sort of like out of the millions of possible stories that can be generated.
You
can pick out good ones.
I have. I mean, I think that I mean, it's really a special. It's a special case of the generation question, right? If you know how to select the good ones, wouldn't it be better if you only generated the good ones and didn't generate any of the other ones to begin with, right? But I have to say that really is a very textural move. I am not expecting this to be. I mean, if you look at it, you can see that it's the same sort of text that you have from moving around in that space. But I'm not expecting it to be good reading. I'm expecting it to be a disruption from what we're expecting as what will continue as an interactive situation. Maybe we're expecting an interactive situation to end, but we're not expecting to lose our ability to interact with it. So, I mean, one of the things that's a good thing to pursue, but it's another thing that I've been exploring in poetry generation is how is it that we might simply produce interesting textures of words, because when you think about producing a boundless poem, a poem that can simply continue running, right, then it's sort of the idea. Well, can we pick out some good bits from there? You've already reframed the problem away from that. The question is, how is this program that's running continuously generating text? How is it producing an aesthetic response? How is it interesting to look at as it is? Not is there some product? So, I mean, that stuff going by the screen is not anything like that. But but even when I do think of the things that are more aesthetically interesting, I think my thoughts are more toward how to create those textures.
Did you want to take the last question?
Already answered.
Is it all there? Yeah.
Can I just say thank you very much? Oh, there's one more, the last question. Artemis. Thank you.
If you intend to use any of the non-refined various styles, because the first piece you showed us, to me, it had kind of a detective story
Yes.
style, but the second one, maybe because we didn't explore enough, it didn't have
Yes.
some kind of, I don't know, do you intend to, do you have that embedded already, or do you?
Oh yes, I think. Well, no, I mean it's not a simple matter of choosing a detective, in my system. But I think that these can very easily be composed. I would be hesitant to offer the high level, have on the interface, have on the API, you choosing a high level literary style. But they can be composed in many ways. Like you have frequency, for instance. It can just be whether you, if you have analepsis to an event in the past, that is very punctual, right? The murder occurred Thursday, 9 p.m., 1973. That gives you, even if you're not talking about a murder, it gives you a detective story-like sort of sense. Whereas if you did it to an habitual event, right? I used to hang out in cafes, in the mid-90s, right? It's actually, if you kept doing that continuously, you would see the sort of memoir, detective fiction difference, independent of the content. So these things, I think that if the underlying low-level sorts of narrative controls are set up easily enough for people to use, it'll almost be too easy to do things like that. There would be no point in my creating, except maybe as examples, but certainly not building into the system, those high-level stylistic labels.
Terrific.
Thanks very I think it's,